Good evening, folks. It's been a while since I've been on here, but I've been collecting data about forms of renewable energy slash electric energy, about how electricity forms electricity. Okay. Now, we all know how our current fossil fuels go, is at 60%. Now, renewables are at 21 this is the overall average. Fossil fuels are at 60%, renewables are at 21.4%, and nuclear is 18.6%. So, obviously everyone gets the view of how all that works. Now, we're going to do every state in order, but before we do that, hit the like button, hit the bell for notifications. With that being said, like and subscribe to get more videos like this. And now, I'm going to go through everything the fossil fuels version. Now, natural gas, 43.1%, is what we're mostly made out of. Coal is 16.2%. Petroleum, 0.04%. Petroleum liquids, 0.3%. That's petroleum total, excuse me. But let me start over. Natural gas, 43.1%. Coal, 16.2%. Petroleum total, 0.04%. Petroleum liquids is 0.3%. Petroleum itself, 0.1%. And other gases, 0.3%. Then obviously we just did nuclear. Now renewables, which is the 21.4%. Wind is 10.2%. Hydropower is 5.7%. Solar, 3.9%. Photovoltaic, 3.9%. Solar thermal, 0.01%. Biomass, 1.1%. Wood, 0.8%. Landfill gas, 0.2%. Municipal solid waste, 0.1%. Other biomass waste, 0.1%. Geothermal, 0.4%. Pumped storage hydropower, negative 0.1%. And other sources, 0.2%. Okay, so overall, we have what you call a very limited source of renewable energies, which is very small amounts of renewable energies. Now, if we go on the sources of orders, we will see where everything stands. Starting with the United States. The states with the least amount of renewables to the most renewables. We will go in order from least to most renewables. Starting with Mississippi. At 1% with renewable. Coal at 8%. Fossil fuels 73%. Nuclear 18%. Hydro 0%. Wind 0%, solar 1%. Then we got Delaware at 2%. Coal is at 8%. Fossil fuels 88%. Nuclear, hydro, and wind all at 0%. And solar is 2%. And Connecticut is also 2% at 1% for coal. 55% for fossil fuels. Nuclear is 40%, hydro is 1%, 0 on 1%, 1% for solar. Louisiana is also 2% at 11% coal, 57% fossil fuels, 24% nuclear, 2% hydro, 0% from wind and solar. Now, New Jersey is 2%, is also at 2% with with 2% coal, 48% fossil fuels, 47% nuclear, 0% hydro, wind, and 2% solar, excuse me. I can't talk. Now at 45th, we got Pennsylvania. At 12% coal, fossil fuels at 52%, nuclear at 32%, hydro at 1%, wind at 1%, solar at 0%. Okay. And then we have... Then we have Virginia. At 5%, which is 3% coal, fossil fuels at 58%, nuclear 31%, hydro 1%, wind 0%, solar 4%. Rhode Island also 5%, at 0% coal, 93% fossil fuels, 0% hydrogen, hydro and nuclear, 2% wind, 3% solar. Rhode Island comes in at 41 now. Wisconsin is at 6%, at 44% coal, 33% fossil fuels, 16% nuclear, 3% hydro, 3% wind, 1% solar. Kentucky comes in at 7% with 72% coal, 21% fossil fuels, nuclear, wind, and solar coming in at 0%, and hydro comes in at 7%. Now, Georgia comes in at 7%. Coal is 16%, fossil fuels 47%, excuse me. Nuclear is 29%, hydro is 3%, wind 0%, solar is at 4%. Then we have Arkansas, which is also 7%. Coal is 36%, fossil fuels 34%, nuclear 23%, hydro 7%, wind 0%, solar 1%. Now Michigan is at 8%. It has coal at 33%, fossil fuels at 26%, nuclear at 30%, hydro at 1%, wind at 7%, solar at 0%. Then you get Maryland at 9%, which is coal at 14%, fossil fuels at 36%, nuclear at 40%, hydro at 6%, wind at 1%, solar at 2%. Then Alabama, 20% on coal, 38% fossil fuels, nuclear at 33%, hydro at 8%, wind and solar at 0%. Then New Hampshire is also 9% renewable, with 2% on coal, 26% on fossil fuels, 58% on nuclear energy, 6% on hydro, 3% on wind, 0% on solar. Then you got 10% on Indiana, 61% on coal, 29% on fossil fuels, 0% on nuclear and hydro, 9% on wind, and 1% on solar. So that's a pretty decent amount there. Now, Missouri is on 11%, which is 75% coal, 8% fossil fuels, 6% nuclear, 2% hydro, 9% wind, and 0% solar. Interesting there. Then Illinois is also 11%, at 23% coal, 11% fossil fuels, 54% nuclear, and 11% wind, 0% goes to hydro and solar. Then we got Utah, which is also at 11%, which goes to 63% for coal, 25% fossil fuels, 0% for nuclear, 1% hydro, 2% wind and 8% solar energy. Now, North Carolina is at 13% renewable energy. Coal is at 16%, 37% fossil fuels, 34% nuclear, hydro is 5%, wind is 0%, and solar is 8%. Then we get Arizona, also at 13%. We have the 13% coal, 44% fossil fuels, 29% nuclear, 6% hydro, 1% wind, and 6% solar. And then you have Hawaii, which is 14% renewable. It is 13% coal, 0% fossil fuels and nuclear, 1% hydro, 8% wind, and 6% solar. That's quite entertaining there. And then Tennessee is 15% renewable, at 23% coal, 16% fossil fuels, 46% nuclear, hydrogen at 14%, wind and solar is at 0%. Then Massachusetts also at 15%, has 0% at coal and nuclear, 76% fossil fuels, 6% hydrogen, wind is at 1%, and solar is at 8%. Then you have Nevada at 22%, a big jump there. Coal is at 7%, wind, fossil fuels is at 63%, nuclear is 0%, hydro is 5%, wind is 1%, and solar is 16%. And then you get Wyoming at also at 22%, 75% coal, 2% fossil fuels, nuclear is 0%, hydro is 2%, wind is 20%, coal is 0%. Minnesota is at 26%, with 27% coal, 22% fossil fuels, 24% nuclear, 1% hydro, 21% wind, and 3% solar. And then Texas, which is 20% coal, 44% fossil fuels, 9% nuclear, 0% hydro, 23% wind, and 3% coal. Big area. Now Alaska, which is 27% renewable, 10% coal, 49% fossil fuels, 0% nuclear and solar, 25% hydro, and 2% wind. Now New York, strange as it can be, is 28%, has 0% coal, 45% fossil fuels, 25% nuclear, 23% hydro, wind is 3%, and 1% on solar. Now I flip to the back part here, where we're getting very entertaining on everything here. Where we have Nebraska at 29%, 50% coal, fossil fuels at 3%, nuclear at 18%, hydro is 3%, wind is 26%, and solar is 0%. Colorado is now at 33%. At 42%, and coal is 42%, fossil fuels is 25%, nuclear is 0%, hydro is 3%, wind is 27%, and solar is 3%. Now, California, on the other hand, no surprise here. And the numbers will tell you all you need to know. Coal, 0%. Fossil fuels, and it's California before I read the numbers, California is 36% renewable. And now I go with the numbers. Coal, 0%. Fossil fuels, 47%. Nuclear, 9%. Hydro, 8%. Wind, 8%. Solar, 19%. Now New Mexico is at 36% renewable. At 36, coal is 36%. Fossil fuels, 28%. Nuclear and hydro are 0%. Wind is 30%. Solar is 5%. Then we have North Dakota at 39%. Coal is 57%. Fossil fuels 4%. Nuclear is 0%. Hydro is 5%. Wind is 35%. Solar is 0%. Then we go to Oregon, which is significantly big jump from 39% to 64%. You got 0% for coal and nuclear. Then fossil fuels is 35%. Hydro is 46%. Wind is 16%. And solar is 2%. Then in Idaho, it's 69%. 0% coal. Fossil fuels is 29%. Nuclear is also 0%. Hydro is 49%. Wind is 17%. And solar is 3%. In Washington, which is 74% renewable, you got coal at 3%, fossil fuels at 15%, nuclear at 8%, hydro at 66%, wind at 9%, and solar at 0%. In Vermont, you have coal. You have coal at 0%. You have coal, fossil fuels, and nuclear at 0%, hydrogen at 52%, wind at 16%, and solar at 8%. Now, to top it all out, you have South Dakota at 9%, coal, fossil fuels at 7%, nuclear at 0%, along with solar at 0%, hydro at 29%, wind at 54%. And then, I forgot these. Oklahoma was at 44%, with coal at 14%, fossil fuels at 42%, 0% for nuclear and solar, while hydro is 3%, wind is 41%. Kansas was at 46%, with coal at 34%, fossil fuels at 4%, nuclear 15%, hydro and solar at 0%, while wind is at 46%. Montana is 51%, with 44% coal, fossil fuels 2%, nuclear at 0%, hydro at 37%, wind at 14%, and solar 0.1%. Maine's at 56%, coal 1%, fossil fuels 30%, nuclear 0%, hydro 27%, wind 28%, solar 2%. Then Iowa at 59% has a 32% coal, 9% fossil fuels, 0% nuclear and solar energy, hydro 2%, and wind 57%. That's literally what this is all based off of, is how high the energy cost of how high electric is here. I'll do a second segment on this tomorrow night, and we can probably break this down a little better by numbers. With that being said, I'll speak with you tomorrow, and have a good one. Peace.